In the face of our inevitable morality, we can do one of two things. We can attempt to avoid the thought at all costs, clinging to the illusion that we have all the time in the world, or we can confront this reality, accept and even embrace it, converting our consciousness of death into something positive and active. Something positive and active. In adopting such a fearless philosophy, we gain a sense of proportion, become able to separate what is petty from what is truly, and I mean truly important. Knowing our days to be numbered, we have a sense of urgency and mission. We can appreciate life all the more for its impermanence. If we can't overcome this fear of death, then there is nothing left to fear. Here's a quote by Frederick Douglass. I had to reach a point at which I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a free man in fact, while I remained a slave in form. By the mid-1990s, Curtis Jackson felt supremely dissatisfied with his life as a hustler. The only way up and out that he could see was music. He had some talent as a rapper, but that wouldn't get him very far in this world. He felt somewhat confused about how to break into the business, and he was impatient to begin the process. Then one evening in 1996, all of that changed. At a Manhattan nightclub, Curtis, now known as 50 Cent, met the famous rapper and producer known as Jam Master Jay. He could sense that this was his one opportunity and he would have to make the best of it. He talked Jay into letting him visit the studio the following day to hear him rap. Then he managed to impress him enough that Jay agreed to serve as his mentor. It seemed that everything would fall into place, like the puzzle pieces. 50 had saved money to tide him over while he moved into this new career, but unfortunately, it wouldn't last forever. Jay got him a few gigs, but they didn't really pay. On the streets near his home, he would see his hustler friends doing well, while his funds were dwindling to nothing. What would he do when he ran out of money? He had already sold his car and jewelry. He had already recently fathered a son with his girlfriend, and he needed the money to support the child. He started to feel more impatient than ever. After much persistence, he got someone at Columbia Records to hear his music, and the label became interested in signing him to a deal. But to get out of a contract that he had signed with Jay, he had to give him almost all of the advance money from Columbia. What was worse, Columbia now found himself lost amid all the other rappers signed to the label. His future now looked more uncertain than ever. With his savings almost gone, he would now have to return hustling on the streets, and this made him feel bitter. His former colleagues were not happy to see him again at all. Feeling like he needed the money fast, he became more aggressive than usual and made some enemies on the streets who began to threaten him. He had been splitting time between the record studio and hustling, and his first album at Columbia was about to come out, but the label was doing nothing to promote it. Absolutely nothing at all. Everything in his life seemed to be unraveling at the same time. Then one afternoon in the May of 2000, as he got into the back seat of a friend's car, a young man suddenly appeared in the car window, brandishing a gun and began firing at him in close range. The bullets went all over, 9 of them piercing his body, one that opened a giant hole in his jaw. The assassin then hurried away to an awaiting car, certain he had done his job with a shot to 50's head. 50's friends quickly drove him to the nearest hospital. As it all unfolded, the event itself didn't appear real to him. It was like a movie, something he had seen happen to others. But at one point, while he was being operated on, he sensed that he was close to death, and it all seemed very real. A searing light flooded his eyes, and for a few seconds a shadow crept over it, while everything else came to a stop. It was an oddly calm moment, and then it passed. In the months to come, he would stay in his grandparents' house, recovering from the mortal wounds he had suffered. As he has regained his strength, he could almost laugh at the whole thing. He had cheated death. Of course, for the hustlers in the hood, this was no big deal and nobody would feel sorry for him. He had to move on and not look back, while also keeping an eye on the killers who would be looking to finish the job. In the wake of the shooting, Columbia had canceled his album and dropped him from the label. He was surrounded by too much violence, simply put. 50 would get his revenge. He would launch the kind of mixtape campaign on the streets that would make him famous, and those executives would come back begging, practically begging to sign him. As he geared up for action, however, he noticed something had changed inside of him. He found himself getting up earlier than usual in the morning and write songs late into the night, completely immersed in his work. When it came to distributing his tapes on the streets, he didn't care about making money in the present. He couldn't care less more about clothes, jewelry, or nightlife. Every penny he made, he poured back into the campaign. He didn't pay attention to all the petty squabbles others were trying to drag him into. His eyes were focused on one thing and one thing only, and nothing else mattered. Some days he would work with an intensity that even surprised him. He was putting everything that he had into his one shot of success. There is no backup plan. Years later, as he amassed his business empire, 50 began to encounter more and more people playing strange power games. A company that had partnered with him would suddenly want to renegotiate their contract or act skittish in pulling out, acting as if they had found out about his notorious past, like they didn't know about it before they even signed him. Anyways, perhaps it was just a ruse to squeeze out better terms. There were those at his record label who treated him with increasing disrespect and offered him meager publicity or marketing money in a take it or leave it ploy. Finally, there were those who worked for him from the beginning, but now, smelling money from his success, began to make unreasonable demands. So in other words, when they noticed that, he started doing well more and more and more, they all of a sudden want to stick with him. He's like, nah, man, stay. And that's what's going to happen to you along your journey, guys, is that you are going to encounter people that don't believe in you at first, but when they start seeing you start rising up, then they want to stick around as if, they've been there with you from day one, when in reality, they just want something from you. And to continue reading, certain things matter to him more than anything else. Maintaining his long-term mobility, working with those who are excited and not mercenary, controlling his image and not muddying it for the sake of quick money. What this translated to was very simple. He would exercise his power to just walk away from any situation that didn't resonate with him. And with the record label, he would ignore deploy and pour his own money into marketing his album, the idea of leaving them soon and striking out on his own. He would cut loose to former friends without a second thought at all. In his experience, whenever he felt like it had too much to lose and he held on to others or to deals out of fear of the alternative, he ended up losing more. He realized that the key in life is to always be willing to walk away. He was often surprised that in doing so, or even feeling that way, people would come back to him on his terms, now fearing what they might lose in the process. And if they didn't return, then good for them. If he had thought about it at the time, he realized that turning his back in this way was an attitude and philosophy that had crystallized in his mind that afternoon of the shooting, when death had brushed up against him. Clinging to people or situations out of fear is like desperately holding on to life on even the worst terms, and he had now moved far and beyond such a point. He was not afraid of death, so how could he be afraid of anything anymore? And here's another quote from 50 Cent himself. People talk about my getting shot like it represented something special. They act like they're not facing the same thing, but someday everybody has to face a bullet with his or her name on it. With the language skills that our primitive ancestors developed, we humans became rational creatures, gaining the ability to look into the future and dominate the environment. But with this good came a bad that has caused us endless suffering. Unlike any other animal who are conscious of our mortality. Unlike any other animal, we are conscious of our mortality. This is the source of all of our fears. This consciousness of death is nothing more than a thought of the future that awaits us, but this thought is associated with intense pain and separation. It comes with an intended thought that occasionally haunts us. What good is it to work so hard, defer immediate pleasures, and accumulate money and power if one day, perhaps tomorrow, we die? Death seems to cancel out all of our efforts and makes things meaningless. If we were to give ourselves up to these two trains of thought, the pain and the meaninglessness, we will almost be paralyzed into inaction, or worse, even driven to suicide, if it gets that bad. But consciously and unconsciously, we invent two solutions to this awareness. The most primitive was the creation of the concept of an afterlife that would alleviate all of our fears and give our actions in the present meaning. The second solution, the one has come to dominate our thinking in the present, is to attempt to forget our morality and bury ourselves in the moment. This means actively repressing any thought of death itself. To aid in this, we distract our minds with routines and banal concerns. Occasionally, we are reminded of our fear when someone close to us dies, but we have generally developed the habit of drowning it out with our daily concerns. The problem, however, is that this repression is not really effective. We generally become conscious of our morality around at the age of 4 or 5. At that moment, such a thought had a profound impact on our psyches. We associate it with feelings of separation from loved ones, with the kind of darkness and chaos of the unknown. And it troubled us deeply. This fear has sat inside of us ever since. It is impossible to completely eradicate or avoid such an immense thought. It sneaks in through another door, seeps into our behavior in ways we cannot even begin to imagine. Death represents the ultimate reality, a limit to our days and efforts in a definitive fashion. We have to face it alone and leave behind all that we know and love, a complete separation. It is associated with the physical and mental pain. To oppress this thought, we must then avoid anything that reminds us of death. We therefore indulge in all kinds of fantasies and illusions, struggling to keep out of our minds any kind of hard and unavoidable reality. We cling to jobs and relationships and comfortable positions, all to elude the feeling of separation. We grow overly conservative because any kind of risk, no matter what the risk may be, might entail adversity, failure, or pain. We keep ourselves surrounded by others to drown out the thought of our essential aloneness. We may not be consciously aware of this, but in the end, we expend an intense amount of psychic energy in these repressions. So freaking true. The fear of death does not go away. It merely returns in smaller anxieties and habits that limit our enjoyment of life. There is a third and fearless way, however, to deal with morality. From the moment we are born, we carry inside ourselves our death. It is not some outside event that ends our days, but something within us. We have only so many days to live. This amount of time is something unique to us. It is ours alone, our only one true possession. If we run away from this reality by avoiding the thought of death, we are really, and I want y'all to really listen to this point that I'm about to make, If we run away from this reality by the thought of death, we are really running away from who? Ourselves. We are denying the one thing that cannot be denied. We are living a lie. The fearless approach requires that you accept the fact that you only have so much time to live, and that life itself inevitably involves levels of pain and separation. By embracing this, you embrace life itself and accept everything about it. Depending on a belief in an afterlife or drowning yourself in the moment to avoid pain is to despise reality, which is to despise yourself. When you choose to affirm life by confronting your morality, everything changes. What matters to you now is to live your days well, as fully as possible. You could choose to do this by pursuing endless pleasures, but nothing ever becomes boring more quickly than having to find new ways to search for new distractions. If attaining certain goals becomes your greatest source of pleasure, then your days are filled with purpose and direction. And whenever death comes, you have no regrets. You do not fall into the nihilistic thinking about the futility of it all, because that is the supreme waste of the brief time you have been given. You now have a way of measuring what matters in life compared to the shortness of your days. Petty battles and anxieties have no weight. You have a sense of urgency and commitment. What you do, you must do well with all of your energy, not with the mind shooting off in 100 directions. To accomplish this is remarkably simple. It is a matter of looking inward and seeing death as something that you carry within. It is a part of you that cannot be repressed. It does not mean that you brood about it, but you have continual awareness of a reality that you come to embrace. You convert the terrified, denial type relationship to death into something active and positive. Finally released from pettiness, useless anxieties, and fearful, timid responses. This third, fearless way of approaching death originated in the ancient world, a philosophy known as Stoicism. The core of Stoicism is learning the art of how to die, which is paradoxically teaches you how to live. And perhaps the greatest Stoic writer in the ancient world was Seneca the Younger, born around 4 BC. As a young man, Seneca was an extremely gifted orator, which led to a promising political career. But as a pattern that would continue throughout his life, this gift incurred in the envy of those who felt inferior. In AD 41, the trumped-up charges from the envious courtier Emperor Claudius banished Seneca to an island of Corsica, where he would languish essentially alone for 8 long years. Seneca had been familiar with the Stoic philosophy, but now on this barely inhabited island, he would have to practice it in real life. It was not easy. He found himself indulging in all kinds of fantasies and falling into despair. It was a constant struggle, reflected in his many letters to his friends back in Rome. But slowly he conquered all of his fears by first conquering his fear of death. He practiced all kinds of mental exercises, managing painful forms of death and possible tragic endings. He would make them familiar and not frightening. He used a sense of shame to fear his morality. He abhorred nature himself, which he decreed the death of all living things, and that would mean he was inferior to the smallest animal that accepted its death without complaint. Slowly he extirpated this fear and felt a sense of liberation. Feeling that he had a mission to communicate this newfound power of his to the world, he wrote at a furious pace. In AD 49, he was finally exonerated, recalled to Rome, and appointed to a high position as a praetor and a private tutor to his 12-year-old boy Lucius Domitius. Don't even know how to pronounce the last name, so I'm not going to do that. Son to be known as Emperor Nero. During his first 5 years of Nero's reign, Seneca was the de facto ruler of the Roman Empire, as the young emperor gave himself over to the pleasures that would later dominate his life. Seneca had to constantly struggle to rein in some of Nero's violent tendencies, but for the most part, those years were prosperous and the empire was well governed. Then envy set in again, and Nero's courtiers began spreading stories that Seneca was enriching himself at the expense of the state. By AD 62, Seneca could see all the writing on the wall, and he retired from public life to a country house, handing over almost all of his wealth to Nero. In AD 65, he was implicated to kill the emperor, and an officer he was sent to in the Roman style ordered Seneca to kill himself. He calmly asked permission to review his will. Then he refused. He turned to his friends who would be present and said, being forbidden to show gratitude for your services, I leave you my one remaining possession and my best, the pattern of my life. Now he would be reenacting what he had rehearsed in his mind so many years before. His ensuing suicide was horrifically difficult. He sliced his veins in his arms and ankles and sat in a hot bath to make the blood flow faster, and even drank poison. The death was slow and incredibly painful, but he maintained his calmness to the end, making sure that everyone would see that his death matched his life and philosophy. As Seneca understood, to free yourself from fear, you must work backward. You start with the thought of your mortality. You accept and embrace this reality. Ooh, that rhymed. Bars. You think ahead to the inevitable moment of your death and determine to face it as bravely as possible. The more you contemplate your morality, the less you fear it. It becomes a fact that you no longer have to repress. By following this path, you know how to die well, and so now you can begin to teach yourself how to live well. You will not cling to things unnecessarily. You will be strong and self-reliant, unafraid to be alone. You will have a certain lightness that comes with knowing what matters. You can laugh at what others take so seriously. The pleasures of the moment are heightened because you know their impermanence and you make the most of them. And when your time to die comes, as it will someday, you will not cringe or cry for more time because you will have lived well and have no regrets. Here's a quote by Richard Wright. There seems to hover somewhere in that dark part of our lives an objectless, timeless, spaceless element of primal fear and dread stemming perhaps from our birth, a fear and dread which exercises an impelling influence upon our lives. And accompanying this first fear is what is, for the want of a better name, a reflex to urge towards ecstasy, complete submission and trust. In the past, our relationship to death was much more physical and direct. We would routinely see animals killed before our eyes for food or sacrifices. During times of plague or natural disasters, we would witness countless deaths. Graveyards were not hidden away, but would occupy the center of cities or adjoin churches. People would die in their homes surrounded by friends and families. The nearness of death increased the fear of it, but also made it seem more natural and much more of a part of life. To mediate this fear, religion would play a powerful and important role. The dread of death, however, has always been an intense, and with the weighing of the power of religion to soothe our anxieties, we found it necessary to create a modern solution to the problem. We almost become completely banished by the physical presence of death. We do not see animals being slaughtered for our food. Cemeteries occupy outlying areas and are not part of our consciousness. In hospitals, the dying are cloistered from sight, everything made as antiseptic as possible. That we are not aware of this phenomenon is a deep sign of a deep repression that has taken place. We see countless images of death in movies and in the media, but this has a paradoxical effect. Death is made to seem like something abstract, nothing more than an image on the screen, like video games. It becomes something visual and spectacular, not a personal event that awaits us. We may be obsessed with death in the movies we watch, but this only makes it harder to confront our own mortality. Banished from our conscious presence, death haunts our unconscious in a form of fears, but it also reaches our minds in a form of sublime. The word sublime comes from the Latin meaning up to the threshold or doorway. It is a thought or experience that takes us to the threshold of death, giving us a physical imitation of this ultimate mystery, something so large and vast it eludes our powers of description. It is a reflection of death in life, but it comes in a form of something that inspires awe. To fear and avoid our mortality is debilitating. To experience it in sublime is therapeutic. Children have this encounter with the sublime quite often, particularly when confronted with something too vast or incomprehensible for their understanding. Darkness, the night sky, the idea of infinity, the sense of time in the millions of years, a strange sense of affinity with an animal, etc., etc., etc. We too have these moments in the form of an intense experience that is hard to express in words. It can come to us in moments of extreme exhaustion or exertion when our bodies are pushed to the limit, and travel to some unusual place, or in absorbing a work of art that is too packed with ideas or images for us to process rationally. The French call an orgasm la petite mort, or little death, and the sublime is kind of a mental orgasm as the mind becomes flooded with something that is too much or too different. It is a shadow of death overlapping our conscious minds, but inspiring a sense of something vital and even ecstatic. Understand, to keep death out, we bathe our minds in banality and routines. We create the illusion that it is not around us in any form. This gives us momentary peace, but we lose all sense of connection to something larger, to life itself. We are not really living until we come to terms with our mortality. Becoming aware of the sublime around us is a way to convert our fears into something meaningful and active to counter the repressions of our culture. The sublime in any form tends to evoke feelings of awe and power. Through awareness of what is, we can open our minds to the experience and actively search it out. The following are the 4 sensations of the sublime moment and how to conjure them. So the first sensation is the sense of rebirth. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, Ernest Hemingway felt completely suffocated by all of the conformity and banality of life there. It made him feel dead inside. He yearned to explore the wider world, and so in 1917, at the age of 18, he volunteered as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross in Italy at one of the war fronts. There he felt himself oddly impelled towards death and danger. And in one incident, he was nearly killed by exploding shrapnel, and the experience forever altered his way of thinking. I died then. I felt my soul or something coming right out of my body, like you pull a silk handkerchief out of a pocket by one corner. This feeling remained in the back of his mind for months and years to come, and it was oddly exhilarating. Surviving death in this way made him feel like he was reborn inside. Now he could write of his experiences and make his work vibrate with emotion. This feeling, however, would fade. He would be forced into some boring journalistic job or routines of married life. The inner deadness returned and his writing would suffer. He needed to feel that closeness to death in life again. To do so, he would have to expose himself to new dangers. This meant reporting on the frontline activity in the Spanish Civil War, and later covering the bloodiest battles in the French and World War II. In both cases, going beyond reporting and involving himself in combat, he took up bullfighting, deep-sea fishing, and big game hunting. He would suffer innumerable auto and airplane accidents, but this was only for his need for more risk. Out of each experience, the sensation of being sparked back to life will return, and he could find his way to yet another level. The feeling of having your soul pulled out of your body like a handkerchief is the essence of a sublime sensation. For Hemingway, it could be conjured only by something extreme, by a brush of death itself. We, however, can feel the sensation and its reviving benefits in smaller doses. Whenever life feels particularly dull or confining, we force ourselves to leave familiar ground. We can force ourselves to leave familiar ground. This could mean traveling to some particular exotic location, attempting something physically challenging, a sea voyage or scaling a mountain, or simply embarking on a new venture in which we are not certain we can succeed. In each case, we are experiencing a moment of powerlessness in the face of something large and overwhelming. This feeling of control slipping out of our hands, however short and slight, is a brush with death. We may not make it, we have to raise our level of effort. In the process, our minds are exposed to new sensations. When we finish the voyage or a task and come to safe ground, we feel as if we are reborn. We felt that this slight pull of the handkerchief, we now have a heightened appreciation for life and a desire to live it more fully. The second is the sense of evanescence and urgency. The first half of the 14th century in Japan was a time of intense turmoil. Palace coups and civil wars turned the country upside down. Those of the educated classes felt particularly disturbed by this chaos, and amidst this revolution, a low-ranking palace poet, later known as Kenko, decided to take his vows and become a Buddhist monk. But instead of retiring to a monastery, he remained in the capital of Kyoto and quietly observed life around him as the country seemed to fall apart. He wrote a series of short pieces that were not published in his lifetime, but were later collected and printed under the name Essays in Idleness, the fame of this book increasing with time. Many of his observations centered on death, which was all too present in that period. But his thoughts around death went into the opposite direction of brooding or morbidity. He found in them something pleasurable and even ecstatic. For instance, he pondered the evanescence of the beautiful things such as cherry blossoms of youth itself. If man were never to fade away like the dews of Additional, never to vanish like the smoke of Terabiyama, but lingered on forever in the world, how things would lose their power to move us. The most precious thing in life is its uncertainty. I'm going to repeat that one more time. The most precious thing in life is its uncertainty. This made him think of the insects that live only for a day or for a week, and yet how crowded such time could be. It is the shadow of death that makes everything poignant and meaningful to us. Kenko continuously found new ways to measure the vastness of time as it stretches into eternity. A man was now buried one day in the cemetery in view of Kenko's residence in Kyoto, the grave marker surrounded by grieving members of the family. As the years went by, he wrote they would come less and less often, their feelings of sorrow slowly fading away. With the span of time, they would all be dead, and with them the memory of the man they had buried. The grave marker would become largely covered by grass. Those who would pass by centuries later would see it as a weird mix of stone and nature. Eventually, it would disappear altogether, dissolving into the earth. In the face of this undeniable reality of this eternal expanse, how could we not feel the preciousness of the present? It is a miracle to be alive even one more day. There are two kinds of time we can experience, the banal and the sublime variety. Banal time is extremely limited in scope. It consists of the present moment and it stretches out to a few weeks ahead of us, occasionally farther. Locked in a banal time, we tend to distort events. We see things as far more important than they are, unaware that in a few weeks or a year, what stirs us all up will not matter. Big old facts, guys. Big old facts. The sublime variety is an initiation of the reality of the utter vastness of time and the constant changes that are going on. It requires that we lift our heads out of the moment, and another strategy to cultivate sublime time is the sense of awe. We are creatures that live in language. Everything we think and feel is framed by words. Which never really quite express reality. They are merely symbols. Throughout history, people have had all kinds of unique experiences in which they witness something that exceeds the capacity to express it in words and elicits a feeling of awe. By 1915, the great explorer Ernest Shackleton found himself and his crew marooned on an ice floe near the continent of Antarctica. For months, they floated in this desolate landscape before managing to rescue themselves later the following year. During the time on the floe, Shackleton felt as if they were visiting the planet before humans and arrived on the scene, seeing something unchanged for millions of years. And despite the threat of death he felt oddly exhilarated. In the 1960s, the neurologist Oliver Sacks worked on patients who had been in a coma since the 1920s, victims of the sleeping sickness epidemic of the time. Thanks to a new drug, they were awakened from this coma, and he recorded their thoughts. He realized that they viewed reality in a much different way than this page will turn in a much different way than anyone else did, which made him wonder about our own preconception of the world. Perhaps we see only the part of what is happening around us because our mental powers are determined by habits and conventions. There could be a reality we are missing. During such meditations, he slipped into the sense of the sublime. In the 1570s, Huguenot pastor named John de Lere was one of the first Westerners to live among the Brazilian tribes in the Bay of Rio. He observed all kinds of rituals that frightened him in their barbarity, but then one evening he heard a tribesman singing in a way that was so strange and unearthly. He was overwhelmed by a sudden sense of awe. I stood there transported with delight, he later wrote. Whenever I remember it, my heart trembles and it seems that their voices are still in my ears. This sense of awe can be elicited by something vast or strange. Endless landscapes, the sea or desert, monuments from the distant past, pyramids of Egypt, the unfamiliar customs of people in a foreign land. It could also be sparked by the things in everyday life. For instance, focusing on the dizzying variety of animal and plant life around us took millions of years to evolve in its present form. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, who wrote about the sublime, felt it in holding a swallow in his hands and gazing into his eyes and feeling a strange connection between the two of them. It can be created by particular exercises in thinking. Imagine, for example, that you had always been blind or were suddenly granted sight. Everything you saw around you would seem strange and new. The freakish form of trees, the garishness of the color green. Or try to imagining Earth in its actual smallness, a speck in vast space. The sublime on this level is merely a way of looking at things in their actual strangeness. This frees you from the prison of language and routine, this artificial world we live in. Experiencing this awe on any scale is like a sudden blast of reality, therapeutic and inspiring. And I think this is the last part of, the ways to tap into the sublime. But it goes something like this. The sense of oceanic, the connection of all to all life. In not confronting our mortality, we tend to entertain certain illusions about death. We believe that some deaths are more important or meaningful than others. That of a celebrity or a prominent politician, for instance. We feel that some deaths are more tragic, coming too early or from some form of accident. The truth, however, is that death makes no such discrimination. It is the ultimate equalizer. It strikes rich and poor alike. For everyone, it seems to come too early and can be experienced as tragic. Absorbing this reality should have a positive effect upon us all. We share the same fate with everyone. We all deserve the same degree of compassion. It is what ultimately links us all together, and when we look at the people around us, we would see their mortality as well. This can be extended further and further into the sublime. Death is what links us all to living creatures as well. What links us to all living creatures as well. One organism must die so another can live. It is an endless process that we are a part of. This is what is known as the Oceanic Feeling, the sensation that we are not separated from the outside world, but that we are part of life in all of its forms. Feeling at this at the moments in ecstatic reaction, this is the very opposite of the morbid reflection of death. Reversal of perspective. In our normal perspective, we see death as something diametrically as opposed to life, at a separate event that ends our days. As such, it was a thought that we must dread, avoid, and repress. But this is an idea that is actually born out of fear. Life and death are inextricably intertwined, not separate. The one cannot exist without the other. That from the moment we are born, we carry our death within ourselves as a continual possibility. If we try to avoid or repress the thought, keeping death on the outside, we are cutting ourselves off from life as well. If we are afraid of death, then we are afraid of life. We must turn this perspective around and face reality from within, finding a way to accept and embrace death as a part of being alive. Only from such a position, we can begin to overcome the fear of mortality and then all of the smaller fears that plague our lives. When I nearly died, it made me think, this can happen again at any second. I better hurry and do what I want. I started to live like never before. When the fear of death is gone, then nothing can bother you and nobody can stop you. A quote from 50 Cent.